of day. I'd like to open today's event by remembering that the land we are on is the homeland of the Dakota people. We honor and respect this land out of respect for the Ojibwe and the Dakota nations of Minnesota. We have one program application deadline coming up, and that is for the John E. Sawyer seminars, and that's due by February 20th, which I believe is next Wednesday?
Yes.
Okay, due next Wednesday. So if you're interested, there's a lot more information on the application process and the program on the IAS website. Also, next week, at the same time, same place is...
oh, it should be in Best Buy.
Oops. It's in Best Buy. Okay, thank you. I like this. We have a collective correction feature. Okay, so next Thursday is part of our year-long 1968-69 series with Northrop and the University Honors Program. And our speaker will be Roger Lanius, who's the chief historian from NASA, and he'll be talking about why go to the moon, Apollo, the space race, and the many phases of lunar exploration. We might want to have a moment of silence for the Mars rover before the event. All right, today's talk is co-presented by the Moving Image and Media Studies Graduate Group Research and Creative Collaborative, and we're very grateful to them for organizing this. It's co-sponsored by the Hubbard School of Journalism and Mass Communications, DASH, the Digital Art Sciences and Humanities Program, and the Departments of Art History and Art History. So thank you all for your co-sponsorship and your organizing. And it is my great privilege to introduce Rick Prelinger, who is an archivist, a writer, a filmmaker, and actually the person who's responsible for the biggest source of fun in my teaching, which is the Prelinger collection. I have used public health videos on, formerly film strips on how to brush your teeth, sex ed. I particularly like the films where the girl gets, quote, in trouble, and the word pregnancy is never mentioned in the entire film. Where there are many, many, many more industrial hygiene films. This has made my intellectual teaching life so rich, so thank you, Rick. I really appreciate that. And Rick's collection of 60,000 ephemeral films was acquired by the Library of Congress in 2002, but beginning in 2000, he partnered with the Internet Archives, so you can go find them yourself, to make about 7,000 of these films available online for free viewing, downloading, and reuse. His archival feature, Panorama Ephemera, in 2004, played in venues around the world, and his feature project, No More Road Trips, received a Creative Capital Grant in 2012. His 25 Lost Landscapes participatory urban history projects have played to many thousands of viewers in San Francisco, Detroit, Oakland, Los Angeles, and elsewhere. He's a board member of the Internet Archive and frequently writes and speaks on the future of archives and issues relating to archival access and regeneration. With Megan Shaw Prelinger, he co-founded an experimental research library in San Francisco in 2004, which serves over 1,000 artists, researchers, and activists each year. He is currently professor of film and digital media at the University of California, Santa Cruz. And, whoops, sorry, I got ahead. So please welcome Rick.
Thank you. I'm going to do some actual tech here. Great. Thank you, Jennifer, for your territorial acknowledgement. I was going to do it. I'm glad that it's been done. What I just want to add to that is that much of my talk, and I think many of our concerns have to do with access and inclusion and exclusion, and I hope we'll consider where we ourselves stand in these processes of territorial settlement, possession, dispossession, and so on. I want to thank all of you for coming. I want to thank the organizers who've kept in really good touch with me and given me a welcome. Thank you all for your hospitality and for coming. Oh, I'm supposed to use this, right? Is that better? Is that better? Okay. Also, I just wanted to put in a plug for Dr. Lanius's talk. He's a very interesting man. He was a historian of the Latter-day Saints Church history before he became a space historian, and he's drawn some very interesting parallels between LDS Church doctrine and history in the space program. The LDS Church is extremely friendly to space exploration, and you might ask him about that. Also, he is my spouse's mentor in many ways. My spouse is a historian of technology, and women don't always get much of a welcome in that field, but Roger Lanius has championed women's careers, so props to him. In the last 25 years, we've displaced much of our culture, our labor, and our record keeping into the digital domain. Whether or not this displacement is a lateral or a hierarchical split remains to be seen. But when it comes to splits, the physical and digital split in particular, we're deeply caught up in binary thinking. And binarism bleeds and sprawls like my beloved California landscape. It affects the way that we think about media, about good and bad taste, about inclusion and exclusion, time and memory, wealth and poverty. So I hope that this talk might contribute to helping us think beyond these divides. It will center a bit on archives because that's what I know best, but also because I think archives offer us a way to think less hierarchically and more hybridly. I want to be very clear that this talk isn't just a case study. I hope to venture beyond archives as we commonly think of them, as repositories for the cultural, social, institutional, and family record. Rather, I want to propose that we can begin with what we know and tend to take for granted about the digital turn, about archives, about history, and then go further. So let me try and take you on a short journey that's both contrarian and speculative. Was there ever a good time for the turn to digital? That's impossible to answer, but its disruptive effects are happening at the same time as all manner of cultural, social, and existential anxieties. Climate change, weather extremes, politics as performance, dramatic maldistribution of wealth and power, just to name a few. But while recognizing the drama of the digital turn, I also want to stop short of using revolutionary language. There's no light switch between past and future. Nothing's either old or new, nothing completely material or immaterial. This is the situation, I think many of you will know this, that Raymond Williams classically described, where the residual, what remains from the past, and the emergent, what's emerging out of the future, coexist and interbreed. This is especially true in media. The residual is often, perhaps always, emergent, and the emergent tends towards the residual. Old and new fuzz together, like that famous shot in Hitchcock's Vertigo that simultaneously zooms in and tracks backward. I hope I got that right. Maybe it tracks in and print is dying, but new forms are emerging. Old vinyl records are left on the street while new pressings are sold at premium prices. Film is simultaneously over and in resurgence thanks to, I don't know, Netflix. This is an authentic, unset up shot of unboxing a home movie collection. I love when to be fair, I need to credit the digital turn for my own emergence. My own film archives were sequestered in metal cans, sitting on high shelves in poorly lighted rooms. They were resistant to access, difficult to watch, unwieldy to repurpose. After it became more affordable to transfer and digitize films, and later to scan films straight to digital, we were able to make them available online for free downloading, viewing, and reuse, as you said. This changed my life. It's a great privilege to give things away. And I hope it enabled the work of many makers who might not have otherwise been able to break that commercial wall that separates people from archives. And as a result, I've received probably more validation than most archivists have. But not everybody's experience has been as positive as mine. Can we unequivocally state that digitality has changed our lives for the better? While the digital turn has vastly enriched some of us, it's also amplified divides, accelerated inequalities, elevated the possibility of historical amnesia, and brought us new and onerous forms of labor. This story came out last week and got me thinking about the old labor song, "Which Side Are You On?" The technically literate and manipulators of symbols, and those who serve other people face to face and maintain the world as we know it. Two sides. People whose day-to-day experiences happen mostly in the digital domain versus those who live and work mostly in physical spaces. A divide that's partly congruent with a digital turn. But no, that's far too simple. Funny things happen when people's agency is displaced into the symbolic domain. The old relationship between digitality and privilege is flipping. And the digital domain, which used to be associated with privilege, is increasingly associated with powerlessness. We're starting to see evidence of a reverse digital divide. Getting the personal attention of a bureaucrat, collecting and touching artisanal objects, wearing natural fibers, writing with a nice pen, these are privileged encounters. The rest of the world wrestles with touch-tone menus, disrespectful algorithms, synthetics and plastics in different online government services, the DMV, and poorly designed websites. And slow media, if you can afford it, slow media is coming back. Some friends have been building an intentional community in Mendocino County on the northern California coast. They've installed fiber on their farm, but it moves bits slowly on purpose. And for a long time, they chose to keep their internet up only between 8 a.m. and 5 p.m. Inconvenience, but voluntary. Like many technologies, digital technologies were introduced unevenly. They were at once there and not there. For many years, they were associated with privilege. It took years for computers and broadband to percolate down the class scale. Smartphones, even though expensive, pierced the wall. But even today, 11% of Americans don't use the internet. Digital isolation magnifies inequalities. The digital divide was and still is very real. But in recent years, we see two related trends. Groups of less powerful people have developed into tech vanguards. Two dramatic examples are youth, for whom the majority of online experiences are arguably designed, and African Americans, 91% of whom own smartphones. Comparable figures, 94% of Asian Americans own smartphones, 90% of Latinx people own smartphones. I'm always amazed how the day laborers in the Bay Area, although there's many fewer of them now because they're scared to show their faces, coordinate their work activities, in an extremely sophisticated manner through smartphones, even though their labor may be considered unskilled. Black Twitter is a cultural space for complex performance of identity, as well as a powerful tool for communication to make social change. In a society, in a society that markets their images but limits their agency, these groups have taken on the symbolic domain and negotiated their own relationships with it. And sometimes these relationships are reverse images of those that exist in the social and political world. We've invented new forms of digital labor that insidiously mask the distinction between work and leisure. I toggle seamlessly between work I'm accountable for and the maintenance of my social media personality. One mode is paid, the other unpaid, but it all takes place in the same machine space. and mobilizes the same mind and body functions. Both tire me out. And as we all know, my digital leisure creates great value for businesses that will indirectly sell me back my labor that's built into the goods and services that I buy. And the digital turn has brought about new injuries and caused many of us to experience old wounds in new ways. There are the workers who once worked with physical objects, whose labor and skills are no longer needed. There's the loss of countless library books and other textual materials that are no longer accessible in their original forms. Now we see only pictures of them, and the ease of digital access is often countered by an infinitely harder use experience. There's the trauma re-experienced by cultures that have been marginalized for many years and are now exposed on the internet in ways over which they have no control. I'm thinking here especially about indigenous cultures whose traditional knowledge is shared in ways that violate custom and taboo. And there's everything we read about in the press: trolling, the harassment of women and peoples of color, the mass propagation of lies, the violation of people's right to opacity. None of this new, but accelerated and amplified to an unprecedented scale. All of these are digital wounds. Much of the harm we attribute to digitality, we could actually attribute to social media. Social and media, two deceptively simple yet complex words that combine into such a toxic, explosive compound. So much of people's aggregate digital experience is actually mostly about experiencing social media. Should that lead us to think differently about the significance of the digital turn? In other words, is there a difference between the digital turn and the explosion of social media? These pictures, the first one is me, back when I was into Foursquare. I was mayor of the earth once. I love that joke, when Foursquare came out, that there's a political crisis in America. All the city's mayors are at South by Southwest. And then on the right is a recent screen grab of my father's 5 Facebook accounts. He's 92. And although he used to write code, he's not very good with machines anymore. And I've come to consider iOS elder abuse. And he's an obedient Austrian who, whenever they say upgrade something or look at this message, he does it. And so he has 5 Facebook accounts. I got it down to 1 at one point, but then it mushroomed up again. The ancestral traces of social media are all over the place, but one of them has undeniable working class roots. I'm talking, just one of many examples, about QSL cards. Originally, these were used by licensed and fairly skilled radio amateurs, radio hams as they're called, who exchanged them to memorialize a radio contact. But with the viral growth of interest in citizens band radio, CB radio in the 60s and 70s, CB operators got into the act. And CB operators traded QSL cards without needing to talk with one another on the radio first. It was like friending somebody. It was a means of making a certain kind of contact, confirming a certain kind of friendship that was more than non-committal and less than BFF. There's probably millions of different QSLs, and many of them are as complex and semiotically rich as a deep Tumblr or a MySpace page from the classic era. Here's an Afrofuturist card from Detroit. I bring these to your attention just in case there's anyone who thinks that social media is a project that rose out of the digital turn. These are as physical as they come. It's a little bright here, but this is a segment of a home movie shot by a research physician and epidemiologist named Charles Edward Smith, who in the 30s wondered why people in the Central Valley, agricultural and migrant workers, were getting valley fever. And so he went to investigate, and he shot film. This is a young girl with her ukulele and her father with a fiddle. Have any of you seen The Grapes of Wrath? You know, this book and movie? These are the real people of The Grapes of Wrath, and this is one of the camps that's recreated in The Grapes of Wrath. His films are desperately in need of preservation, as you can see. They won't hold a frame line, but these are the real quote-unquote Okies in Kern County, California. And his films also picture workers of color who were at work, who were extremely prone to valley fever, which is still a big problem. I'm showing this because when we think about inclusion, we should think along a broad spectrum. It isn't just about access to digital tools and services in digital worlds. We shouldn't just be fighting for that. We should also struggle for recognition and respect for what is not digital. Reflexively, we might think that physical materials and that the physical world is pre-digital. But I think that's short-sighted. This is, I've slowed it down because it's tremendously unusual footage of striking workers. We have no context for this yet. The physical isn't necessarily pre-digital. It's going to endure well beyond the digital period, which will end. You know, the digital period isn't an ultimate stage. It's a transitional stage to who knows what. So we should respect the lives and address the lives, the work, and the temporalities of people who don't live their lives on screen, who don't work as symbol manipulators. But we must also avoid privileging or fetishizing either the digital or the physical as best we can. I think that as scholars and activists, we need to foreground hybridity. Hybridity may be our best defense. I'll talk more about this shortly, but I'm afraid that this isn't happening enough in my world, in the world of memory keeping, of libraries and archives. Archives, and especially archivists, are taking sides. These days it seems that you're either a digital archivist or a physical archivist. And typically, there's not a lot of cross-fertilization. If there's any archivists in the audience, I hope that maybe you can help me be more precise about this afterwards. There isn't enough hybridity in the archives field. And if I want, I'm going to try to plant a proleptic thought that I'll pick up again at the bottom of this talk. This divide, this physical-digital divide, is one of the reasons why it's a fantasy that there's any consensus about why archives exist and what they should be doing. I don't think people really agree about that. You see that? Sort of. So, archives. Today, archival materials permeate cultures, and old and new images and sounds intermix in our media and in our minds. Along with everything else, archives used to be nerdy, but they're now chic, and history's moved into the mainstream. More people use archives in special collections, and they're making many more derivative works from them. But while archives have never been more popular, at the same time, they're more precarious. Today's archivists must contend with weaponized amnesia, with scarce and uncertain resources, with technological change, and the flow from a relentless digital fire hose. Historical amnesia is not new. It made our country possible. Amnesia continues to enable colonialism, and it also enables mass entertainment, and now it's become weaponized. We've mass digitized millions of cultural objects, but many of us live in a world that rarely references ideas or events older than, 1997. Even though historical consciousness has never been more urgent, we've taken the urgency out of history. We target historical books and programming to males 45 plus. There's a joke within PBS that says, our demographic is 45 to infinity. And almost, that's true. And almost never is historical programming targeted to emergent youth, except maybe for drunken history. Browser architecture, web browser architecture, does a pretty good job of presenting small pieces of historical insight and small bites of evidence, but it hasn't yet gotten good at presenting complex texts or ideas either, by the way, have most documentary films. So a clean and spare world. Digital emergence has birthed a sense that we've moved beyond the era in which information and culture is embodied principally in physical objects. And so we might say that digital emergence rests on the assumption of analog marginality. It's sort of gotten to be zero-sum. And so a lot of librarians and archivists are tasked by their management to clear shelves of rarely consulted physical materials. Shelf clearing is real and it's deeply destructive. Here are a few examples of inconvenient media objects that have been disappearing from libraries and archives. And I have to say that quite often the decision to digitize and destroy, or simply to deaccession, isn't a bad decision in and of itself. It's probably not necessary for the 10 campuses of University of California to have 10 government documents repositories. But we have to reckon with the sum of many decisions that profoundly change the way we connect with culture. And all sorts of anxieties coalesce in the desire to divest ourselves of the physical, And I should be talking about Marie Kondo here, but I haven't yet come to terms. For some, the turn to digital is a turn to purity, away from inconvenient, old, disease-ridden, in quotes, or culturally infected objects. Of course, digital materials are neither pure nor clean themselves. They rot, they drop out, they glitch out, they fall victim to format obsolescence, or the companies that we trusted to maintain them move on or disappear. There are worries about clutter and hoarding. Most normative images of living, working, and communal spaces today show environments that are spare and open. Storage is rationed, and since it's assumed to be digital, it's generally invisible. Media scholar Erica Vigilin remarks brilliantly, she hasn't written this, and I hope she does. She remarks on how we stigmatize physical accumulation, but we reward digital hoarding. Scott Herring's excellent book, The Hoarders, which I can't recommend enough. Do any of you know this book? He's a queer literary scholar in Indiana, and he's written a deeply anti-normative and I think a very courageous book called The Hoarders. It talks at length about how hoarding is stigmatized and equated with mental distress. But at the same time, he tries to find logic, reason, and artfulness in practices of accumulation. He's written a really wonderful essay about Jonah Barnes, who everybody thought went crazy, but he finds in her craziness a rigorous modernist literary practice. We cannot let today's ideas of clutter overdetermine tomorrow's access to history. And more fundamentally, our attitudes towards material objects have become infected with what historians call presentism. We are presentists when we apply current modes of thinking to the past and future. Right now, it's very tempting to eternalize the present and imagine a future that have not, based on trends that haven't been with us for very long. It is presentism to regard digitality as the negation of physical media. Do physical objects have the right to exist? In fact, a crisis ecosystem of evidence-bearing physical objects has become really fascinating. I didn't do this. This is a machine at the Internet Archive that's going to have disk drives in it, and then you're going to use it when you download something, but somebody put a book there. The displacement and expulsion of physical materials in favor of digital surrogates is akin to urban gentrification. And as archivists, scholars, and citizens, we will one day have to answer for it. We're basing entire new phenomenological, philosophical, and scholarly agendas on one recent technological turn. And for some reason, we find ourselves staging a battle against physical materials in order to make room for apparent digital abundance. The record of daily life and ephemeral print culture could be an inclusive record of the experience of communities that are often left out of mainstream histories. It's the record of these people and what they read, what they saw, what they heard, and what they wrote, made, and spoke. Much of this record is physical and it's expensive to maintain. And there are real questions of equity surrounding the decisions to collect or not to collect, to retain or to divest. Every generation, every community should have the right to access, assimilate, study, and critique the cultural heritage that surrounds them. The freedom to uncollect is asymmetric. Those whose cultures are erased by uncollecting generally have no say in the matter. You know, I want to shout out to the Minneapolis Public Library, and I don't know that this is still true, but the last time I was here, I went into the stacks, and you cross the bridge, and you go into the area where they've put all the books that are not actively circulating. Most libraries would have pitched them, but your public library kept them, at least as far as I can tell, and that's practically unique among large urban American public libraries. Neither nostalgia for the physical nor the celebration of digital conquest make a lot of sense. To transcode a formulation from artist and writer Jen Bervin, it's becoming clear that physical and digital materials each have different jobs to do. In fact, a turn to digital revalidates the analog. The affordances of digital media, the properties that make certain actions possible, are giving us a new understanding about how physical media forms actually work. We learn about physical materials because of digital materials. Ebooks have taught us a great deal about physical books, and there are weavers today who take their inspiration from digital screens. And as the Austrian film curator Alex Horvath has pointed out, the renaissance of Baroque era musical instruments, as in this great film, is a relatively recent phenomenon. Digital and physical materials defamiliarize one another. For me, this goes a long way to explain the value of physical materials and why you can't separate physical and digital. Defamiliarization, you know, a word that its roots probably go back to the Russian futurists, estrangement, ostranjenje, I'm gonna mispronounce that. Defamiliarization means making the familiar strange so that we can see it with new eyes. It means seeing something in a different context. It's like bringing your partner home to the parents for the first time, or letting a dog loose to run in the waves. Physical objects are remembrance objects. They're reminders of how systems of communication, representation, information, and labor functioned and often still work. It's taken the aggressive onset of digitality to teach us more about the specific affordances of physical materials. And it may take the awful bifurcation of our economy to teach us about the dogged persistence of the physical. So, how can we look beyond simple physical virtual binaries to redistribute power and heal digital wounds? I want to cite my own, I'm sorry, this is, we're trying to push too much bandwidth through this little dongle, so that's why it's not looking great. This is New York in 1945. I'm not asserting that the projects I'm going to mention have redistributed power and healed wounds, but they've taught me a great deal about the potential of passing on, oh, that's amazing. I've just indemnified the University of Minnesota for any, in case there's any distortion of my image owing to technology and so it isn't easy to model new worlds, but the cultural space is wide open for remodeling. So, you know, we can model new forms of cultural distribution that might give us a hint at what new modes of property distribution might look like. We might talk about enhancing public memory through restructuring public archives. So let's talk about archives. During the 1980s, I collected a couple of 100,000 cans of historical film. I supported the collection by charging people to use stock footage, which barely supported the archives, but there was a big problem. Film is really inconvenient. It's hard to jump the wall between the object and the people who need it or who want to use it. But then when I returned to California in 1999, I was almost immediately drawn into this emergent digital culture that was nothing like my previous experience in New York City, where information still wanted to be expensive. When in the first 30 seconds of our acquaintance, Brewster Kahle, the Internet Archive founder, said, why don't you put your collection online for free? I was a little wary, but soon enthusiastic. This changed my life, and it gave me a bit of a contrarian perspective that doesn't fit very neatly into the dominant discourses of archival practice and librarianship. Probably 500 million films have been viewed or downloaded. I can't tell you how many derivative works have been made. You know, I went into the Minnesota Science Center about 15 years ago, and I saw one of our films playing as part of an exhibit. Nobody asked, and that was great. Nobody should have to ask, right? The material's propagated. But we breached that commercial wall. We have a library in San Francisco, which has held on for, this is its 15th year, despite all the new development, which you see out the window. This is all very new. But remember print? After we gave away films, it was possible to imagine a different kind of library. And so my partner and I tried to open the experiment of opening our collection of printed materials to the public in '04. This continues. We have a lease through the end of 2021. The word library is an extremely poor description. It's like archives. It's no longer a good word. It's really a workshop for social reading, collaborative work. It's incubated countless artworks, publications, events, research projects. And it suggests to us a key idea that if you're a cultural institution that collects, you might want to think about yourself as a workshop and not simply as a repository, but a place where new work is made from old collections. We also don't associate print with emergent people, but our patrons are mostly between 18 and 35, and a lot of them skew quite young, which is exciting. Community has built around the collection. We see about 1,200 visitors a year. Touching, browsing, and reading books has become a privileged experience these days. The physical collection serves as an index to the books we've scanned, which usually it's the other way around. You know, you look up in a database and then find a book. But in every way, this is a digital physical hybrid project. We've scanned almost 4,000 books. And we find that our users find all sorts of research hooks and material that other libraries have junked. This is the United States Census Atlas of 1890, which is almost every spread is about race and religion and national origin. Public assembly. So what does public assembly mean? It's this. If you get people to come out and go to a movie, if you get them in a theater, what can you do with that group of people? Couldn't you do more than just show a film? These days it's a tremendous accomplishment to get people out of wherever they are or away from their telephones and to join together in a big room. And so since 2006 I've made these 25 urban history film events that Jennifer mentioned. There's been about 105 of these occasions, and each one of them brings together footage of urban history, from home movies, from studio-produced background process plates. Remember, in old movies, somebody gets into a car and you see in the background the streets going by. It turns out that that's actually an amazing record of what cities used to look like. Industrial films, other things. Critically, these screenings happen in front of an audience that is encouraged to talk. I tell them that you are the soundtrack and that your job is to identify people, places, and events, to ask questions, to make your opinions clear, to disagree with your neighbors. It's a dialogic space. It isn't about the past, it's about urban futures. There's no attempt here to do what happens in most contemporary documentary. There's no compelling characters, no narrative arc, no catharsis. At the end, they look kind of underproduced. In fact, they're quite intricate. And one of the reasons I think that it's a little interesting, that's interesting now, is that there's a lot of work going on in interactive and participatory documentary, sometimes called iDocs. And much interactive documentary is mediated through technology. It happens in the browser. It uses an app. It leverages social media to connect members of the audience or to bridge that distance between what you see on the screen and the experience. And I'm not into algorithm. I support it, but I'm into public assembly. So my new slogan is assembly over algorithm. So at first I thought this was radical, but I soon realized it was completely traditional. In the Elizabethan theater, the pits in front of the stage were often said to be populated by the rowdy groundlings who commented very loudly on the plays and the performers. This, you could argue, is a highly engaged form of audience interactivity, akin to what happens maybe at a sports event. And later, the theatrical space functioned as a kind of virtual stage onto which racially integrated audiences, against the law, performed social relations. Elizabeth Maddock Dillon has written a great book called New World Drama, the performative commons in the Atlantic world. And she talks about how when the common lands were taken away from the common people, when they were deterritorialized, the commons was remapped into the space of the theater. So 18th and early 19th century audience members didn't just go to the theater to see a play. They went to represent themselves, to make common space, often common cause. In 1804, a Boston writer complained that the theater didn't have bright enough lighting during the show because people weren't there just to see the play. And then when Richard III was performed at the Bowery Theater in New York in 1832, over 300 audience members swarmed the stage to assist in slaying the tyrannical king. That's interactivity. These are quintessential digital products. Projects. They need digital scanning, they need editing, they're projection, they're HD, but they're made from completely analog sources, and they play out, they articulate in a domain that's preeminently physical. They encourage people to raise their voices in the presence of many others. And perhaps these kinds of projects leads us towards a commons, but perhaps we also need to rethink the idea of a commons and to understand how, at least in North America, the commons rests upon foundational violence and dispossession. We can't speak of resources being held in common when we've already stolen them, to quote, to paraphrase Gomez Barras. At the same time, I want to propose public assembly and the raising of voices as a counterforce to media that insists upon being consumed in silence and hires private guards to police its theaters. Community audiences respond quite well to original documents. This is a film shot in 1944, probably by a man named Charles R. Lynn, who was reports officer at the euphemistically named Jerome War Relocation Camp in Arkansas. This was a concentration camp for Japanese Americans who were uprooted from their homes, farms, and other activities in Southern California. And I have a lot of this. I'm just going to show you a tiny bit. This is a film that turned up on eBay, and it's played quite a role within the survivor community. I had the privilege of standing on the stage with a survivor of this camp in Arkansas, who was able to narrate it based on his own experience, and it's been seen about 40,000 times since we put it online. This is an unusual film because this was the last camp to open and the first to close, and in fact it's picturing the release of the incarcerated Japanese Americans, and as well as the kind of daily activities of the white staff of the War Relocation Authority. But you know, it's all the memes that we associate with World War II in Europe, right? People being put on trains against their will and taken places and being moved around and processed in great number. And yet here it is, the United States. This you can see online. You can just search for Jerome camp and Japanese Americans. But I think it's it's an example of the kind of material which, when reconnected with a community that has a special concern, very interesting things can happen. So a few lessons. We can't exclusively thrive in either analog or digital worlds. We need to think about what it might mean to be radically traditionalist, to exploit the possibilities of physical digital hybridity and materiality as a way of remediating our poorly conscious rush to the digital. This doesn't mean rejecting technology. It might mean being more imaginative about how we use it. Do we simply retain physical objects? Well, while physical objects have great psychological and symbolic power, their existence alone isn't enough to affect power relationships. That said, objects can be shared, objects can be loaned and exchanged, objects can be the basis for performance and social activity. Community, as I said, can coalesce around collections. We might begin by trying to avoid binarism and thinking beyond these polarities, physical and digital. How could we migrate our existing consciousness of hybridity into every aspect of our digital lives? Could we use it as a strategy for confronting power that now manifests digitally? Could we leverage the reverse digital divide and try to share physical goods as broadly as we now distribute digital goods? Could we not only use analog and digital to defamiliarize one another, but to defamiliarize the idea of both physical and digital property? If we embrace analog and digital hybridity, it means honoring the dignity and the labor of those who work and who maintain in all modes. It means resisting a shift of consciousness into these exclusively digital metaphors and promoting ways of thinking that emanate out of physical making as well. It means thinking about materiality and its ties to race, gender, and class. And it means maintaining the records of our time in both analog and digital forms. It means being conscious of physical place and what it means to people, combating the celebration of placelessness. It means looking up from our keyboards and seeing who and what are around us. I love in public globes how they get worn out in important places. This is Detroit Public Library, and you should see Detroit. It's like as big as a baseball that's worn off. We might avoid writing triumphalist narratives in advance. Many of us seem to be celebrating the total victory of the digital, even though this hasn't yet happened. How often have we heard that we'll all achieve infinite cultural memory? Have you seen these news items about using DNA as a storage medium? They suggest that all human knowledge can be preserved in about 6 wine bottles. This, they must have been feeling French that day at Microsoft Research when they wrote that press release. But universal storage is the greatest machine for forgetting that humans might ever imagine. The ability to remember invents the necessity to forget. And if you put all your bits in a bottle, glitch is a real threat. Actually, why do we love glitch so much? It's becoming a real 21st century fetish. I was just at a conference where one of the keynotes was a theory of glitch, except that the speaker said that they didn't yet know what that was. I think glitch is overrated. It's certainly nothing new. Corruption and interruption in the media are proudly and joyously traditional. People have stepped on snapshots, cried over letters until the ink smeared, puzzled over pages that have been torn out of library books, felt the thrill of film burning and blossoming in the gate, projector gate. Glitch has become style. It's jeans with torn kneecaps, unless you fell down while you were running away from the cops. I agree that the glitch exposes the representational toolbox and sometimes the media apparatus, but I have a hard time accepting it as revolutionary any more than supercuts or subversive. It's the most used mode of appropriation where I live, in the fast-growing city of San Francisco that aspires to house 1 million people. if they can find 1 million people who can afford to live there. In my world, actually, glitches are actually organic phenomena, because media preservation itself is a glitch. The normative life cycle of digital media is ephemeral, as Howard Besser stated all the way back in 2001. The default condition of electronic objects is to disappear. And so preservation is the most authentic glitch, especially in our age of massive media abundance. The archivist's job is to hack media so that it can be preserved against its will. So ultimately our era, won't simply be judged by the evanescent digital monuments that we build, but also by the measurable success of what we can fix, invent, and introduce in the physical world. While there are indeed extremely exciting and highly consequential projects that are data-based or data-driven, that involve large-scale modeling or deeply theoretical, like astrophysics and cosmology, there are also huge projects that are preeminently physical and go far beyond moving bits around, climate change, redistributing the Earth's resources, and so on. Another preeminently physical project is permaculture. To give an explanation that is so incredibly simplified, permaculture involves looking at natural patterns and ecosystems and extrapolating those into human agriculture. One of its aspirations is to achieve zero waste agriculture, where inputs and outputs to the system are in balance. And it turns out that permaculture is a fascinating framework for thinking about archival work, or production of any kind for that matter. Use and value renewables, that's about as archival as you get. Design from pattern to detail. This is reminiscent of how the structure of archives in the West works with provenance and the fonds, the idea that archival organization mirrors the structure of the organizations from whom the archival material is taken. Use and value diversity. This is key for production, that you don't want to have a monoculture, but I think most important, use edges, value the marginal. Important things happen at the intersections. Think of the seashore or the lakeshore in Minnesota, where the aquatic and terrestrial organisms meet and recombine, and interesting things happen in the ecosystem. I'm especially interested in the intersections of theoretically, and that sort of mashup, that happens when different discourses rub up against one another and cross-fertilize. I love the permaculture model. It's been criticized and all that, but it's a really nice way to think about keeping the record. Finally, what could happen if we thought differently about archives? Could we start to think about archives not as places where the record of the past quietly rests, but where the reality of the future waits to break free? To paraphrase digital humanist Bethany Novisky, what if we saw archives not just as anchorages, but also launch pads? Not just spaces for retrospect, but spaces for rehearsal. Could we think about archives and other cultural repositories as speculative places where we can imagine, craft, and criticize different ways of making community and society? Could we make that twist where we don't just look to archives for the record of the past, but where we imagine and create the record of the future? Because archives, sorry, this is allergic to something. Because archives are repositories of both trails followed and roads not taken. We can look to archives for evidence that helps us rethink the way that our world has turned out, and we can find intimations of alternate worlds. Archives resist triumphalist visions of progress, and they support us when we question whether what we now experience is inevitable, and question whether the future must be what we're told it will be. At their best, archives can be places where we model alternative and utopian arrangements of society. And this is happening all over, especially in the And again, to speak very generally, the Afrofuturist reconceiving of historical archives. Paintings, speculative fiction, experimental music, all of these lead us to imagine unanticipated futures. We can also imagine them in the archives or in the museum. We can look to the evidence for intimations, hints of futures. Sometimes these futures might be completely imaginary. In 1959, this neighborhood in Detroit near Grand River Avenue was blockbusted, and the Slaby family, along with all the other white people, left. You can see everybody's houses up for sale when unscrupulous real estate agents told them that, quote unquote, the colored are moving in, it's time for you to sell while you can. And since they photographed everything that they were doing, they photographed their neighborhood going up for sale. When I first showed this in Detroit, afterwards an African-American woman came up to me and said, you know, when they moved out, we moved in. This is the neighborhood I grew up in. We weren't supposed to because the deed said you had to be Caucasian, but we moved in anyway. So there was a sense of this sort of toxic document, accompanied at the same time by a sense of hope when it found a new place in the community. Today, archives are becoming more than collecting institutions. They're becoming noisy sites where community conversations transform into theory. Archives are now birthplaces of theory. They're not just quoting Foucault and Derrida and the same old documents that I refuse to teach because they're not really about archives. Bethany Novisky again calls for digital libraries and archives to move past the stage of lenses for retrospect and become spaces for projection, planning, performance, speculation. She talks about Afrofuturism and its counterinsurgencies to inevitability, and points us to projects like Black Quantum Futurism in Philadelphia, which is a project of Rashida Phillips and more others. They're coming really amazing. If you haven't read about Black Quantum Futurism, give it a Google. It's quite amazing. Communities of archivists and thinkers are generating a wealth of new thought, especially feminist identified archivists, archivists of color, queer theorists, community activists, people who work around traditional knowledge and traditional cultural expression. A lot of this kind of got kicked off with the Black Lives Matter movement. There's people to watch like Jared Drake, Burgess Jules, Eric Tansey. I've mentioned Bethany Novisky, Stacey Williams, Ricky Punzalan. New discourses that aren't just about archives are emerging out of archives, and I just love that. It gives archives a new reason to exist. So, to conclude, if archives are to ride the waves as the oceans rise, it won't be as arcs, fully caulked to repel leaks, but as permeable wetlands that are capable of assimilating ebbs and flows, hybridizing venues where past and present and future interchange and transform one another. And it's in this that lies their greatest purpose and occasion for excitement. Once upon a time, but whether in the time past or time to come, is a matter of little or no moment. This wide world had become so overburdened with an accumulation of worn-out trumpery that the inhabitants determined to rid themselves of it by a general bonfire. This is the beginning of Nathaniel Hawthorne's 1844 story, Earth's Holocaust, one of the greatest anti-archival tales. It imagines a moment when the world wants to rid itself of its past and builds a giant bonfire into which everything is thrown. Hawthorne is careful to say that intellect itself cannot serve for humans to distinguish right from wrong. Intellect alone can't justify purification through simplification. The divide between physical and digital media and between our physical and digital lives is as phantasmic as the border wall. When we consciously or unconsciously create binary differences, whose lives are we disrespecting and who stands to gain? Thank you for your attention and patience.
questions, and I'll let Rick field his own questions.
This is the disaster warning system in San Francisco. And this particular node of it was shut down for about 3 months when the red tails started nesting there, which was nice of the city to turn the sound off. Can I take questions or comments or rebukes, rants, and disagreements? Yeah.
Thank you so much for your talk. I have a somewhat speculative question about the future archive and its archiving of contemporary digital versus analog material that is being produced during the digital age. Because it seems like it means something different when people now very consciously choose to still work in analog media to create content, when it is so much easier and cheaper and so on and so forth to use digital tools to do that. So how do you think this kind of choice, I guess, will be archived in the future, and what will it mean?
That's a great and challenging question. I mean, I would partially dispute it because who knows that it's actually cheaper and easier and faster to work in digital than analog? It kind of depends. It's a lot easier for me to write myself and to keep a calendar than it is to use Google Calendar because the interface, there's so much point and click. And it's a little, there's a million examples like that, but the point, I don't at all challenge your point, it's a real question. For one thing, we can't save everything that's digital, just as we couldn't save everything that's analog. It's a pipe dream. It's unsustainable, it takes electricity, it takes the continuing, it implies the maintenance of an infrastructure that's incredibly expensive, and right now it's supported through advertising. When Library of Congress tried to keep the Twitter collection, Twitter said, here's all our tweets. They couldn't do it. They stopped. They never indexed them, they never made them available. I think also people are still creating in physical media. There's an immense amount of physical media that's still being made. And so I think we're forced into a much more nuanced and much less satisfying set of very tentative procedures. And if you want to reduce it down to maybe one take home, it's that we're going to save some stuff and we're not going to save other stuff. And it's going to be largely accidental with some intentionality. It's going to be decentralized. What each one of you do, multiplied by millions, is going to mean a lot more than what centralized government or private organizations do. It's kind of the Fahrenheit 451 thing. Each of us is going to be responsible for certain kinds of records. And the question of whether or not it matters if things are saved is really complicated, and I kind of almost don't want to go there. But I'm not sure that I'm not sure that qualitatively it's changed that much. Would you like to respond?
Well, I'm asking primarily because I always think about the cult of the analog that is so often growing out of the normalization of the digital.
Absolutely right. The digital has been normalized in terms of how we behave with it. The collection and the preservation of the digital is a long way away from being normalized. There are a lot of people right now who are working on personal digital archives, and one of the reasons they're doing it, nobody believes they're going to save very much, but they're doing it to understand people's relationship to the document. And they're also doing PDA, as they call it, because PDA helps illuminate what conventional analog archival practice is all about. So, if we're talking about eternity, and even if eternity is 99 years, which is kind of generally when they plan for digital eternity, it's about 100 years, we're still at a super early stage. So I don't have a good or very satisfying answer for you, but I think it's going to be flux. I don't get very anxious about it. There's a lot of stuff in the press about, oh, we're losing the record of a generation, you know, it's amnesia. It's, a lot of stuff will be saved. And even when material is lost, loss can be formative. You know, you never want to argue for destruction. You never want to say destroy a community's record. That's an act of war. It's an act of cultural aggression. It's happened many times. But loss, erasure, has been a stimulus for us to try to rediscover many histories that have been suppressed or erased or lost over time. So I'm trying to be a little more relaxed about it. Yeah.
The new standards in the European Union for data privacy include something on the order of the right to erasure of one's past.
The right to be forgotten.
Right to be forgotten.
Yeah. What do you think about that? Right to opacity, right to be forgotten.
It seems like a slippery slope to me.
It's a slippery slope. You know, I'm going to quote my friend Howard Besser again. In Europe, they have something called moral rights on top of copyright, meaning that authors have a great deal of control over how their work is presented and excerpted. We don't have it here because the studios have fought it. And one time I said, Howard, what do you think about moral rights? And he says, well, when I'm in a country that has them, I'm against them. And when I'm in a country that doesn't have them yet, I'm in favor of them. And that's kind of the way I feel about the right to be forgotten. It's really ambivalent. There's an extremely thoughtful scholar named Mary Morrell, who's an anthropologist, who wrote about book scanning projects, I think for her dissertation. And she believes that the kind of concern that we now see in traditional cultures, especially indigenous cultures, about, you know, we don't want our cultural expression and our ceremonies and our sacred material to be made public without our permission. She thinks that's going to go mainstream. She thinks that majority cultures are going to start to get protective in the same way that minority cultures have necessarily had to be in. And, you know, that would be the great, we'd get real siloed then. But, you know, humans are quite adaptive. Yeah?
Another thing that occurred to me, there's a person named Richard Millington. He's over in the UK, and he explores the interaction between in-person and online community building. He's with a company called Hybridity, and they did some archived video webinars on that that you can find if you Google name Richard Millington. It should come up. And often when I've gone to in-person events, and we've had some examples of the interaction between archives and the in-person experience, and how people interact in the room. I've often thought when I've been in a particularly niche and very leading edge kind of arts event, maybe a multimedia thing or whatever, that I feel like I'm sitting with my tribe, but there's no effort to make an ongoing community out of that, even to say, you know, well, we're all going to use this hashtag or something. That event planners might have more thought into sort of a responsibility to provide an opportunity for that.
So you're talking about, in a sense, a pop-up kind of culture with without much latency to it.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really interesting thought. So one way people try to address that is by obsessive documentation. You know, if you go to if you go to any, you know, performance event or any demonstration, sometimes the number of, you know, people doing documentation exceeds the number of participants, and there's that. And, you know, when I appeared at the Walker in like '89, they made a tape of my talk there, and, you know, somebody found it in the archives and sent me a picture of it. Nobody's ever listened to it, and nobody ever will. You know, I'd have to do something really bad for people to ever listen to it. I agree. I mean, what's most important? You know, is it adding to the record? Is it making bits, or is it making community? And I'm starting I mean, I love books and everything, and I'm a digital person. I love putting things online, but I think ultimately experiences are probably a lot more important. As a filmmaker, I'm sort of staking my career on making experiences rather than movies that that are just over and then they're over. I think there's a great unfulfilled hunger for deep experience right now that's not being fulfilled by most media. And since it's not being fulfilled by most media, people find it by being fans and developing deep fan culture involvements, or by, the Twitter back channel when something is playing, whatever. I think there's a real need for that. And archives are kind of irrelevant to that. Everybody says, do you record the audio when you have a Lost Landscapes, an urban history thing? And I say I need 200 microphones, and who would listen to it, We have to step back from, it's okay not to, a long answer, excuse me. Yeah.
I have a complicated question that I'm going to try and make simple, and I'll probably fail. But it's about the question of there's like a discourse of historical amnesia. There's also a notion that the young do not know history because they are not interested in it or they are not taught it. And what they know is drunk history. There's also, you're making an appeal also to young people who are populating the archive and making use of it as a kind of workshop. I'm wondering if there's a sense of the amnesia of history or the forgottenness of history is not knowing history at all, not even knowing a center of history that would be normative. And there's, part of the anxiety I almost find myself feeling is that what is understood as historical is it's all marginal. It's all a series of little margins that kind of interconnect in some way, but there's no center against which is judged. I think that's it.
Yeah, that's a great way of putting it. So I don't believe in a historical center either, and I'm not saying, people don't know the canon, people don't know the great books, people don't know the Constitution. That's so far away from what I think. I also don't believe there's a generational divide, but it's more a qualitative divide. It's not a divide that I would say present absent. I think, I teach undergraduates and graduates, and even my youngest students have an extremely astute grasp of history. It's just mapped into very different spaces than, let's say, the history that I would have a grasp of. And it might be experiential when somebody is emerging. As a grown-up, more than literary, more than, let's say, textual, but it is there. And the people I blame for the ahistoricity of our culture are the people who run the culture, and the people who mobilize amnesia in the service of power, for sure. And I joked about drunken history, but that was a way to reclaim history in a way that wasn't, for a younger audience, that wasn't pretentious. And by drunken, it implied sort of a lack of authority, lack of authoritativeness. I thought that was pretty cool. My niece has actually done drunken science. She's part of the drunken science crew in New York. So I'm all in favor of drunken stuff. We should do drunken theory. But I agree. I think it's more sort of topographic than it is about a center being lost. If that's useful answer. There was a hand in the way back. Yeah.
I wonder what the field thinks of the virtual turn. Is that an extension of the digital turn, or is that, you suggested there could be another twist or turn? Because in some sense, the digital is still physical as compared to the virtual, where there's no photograph at all. When the goggles come off, right. there's nothing. So I'm just wondering how you in the field are thinking about that emergent.
It's a great question, and I mean I was a little sloppy here because I'm using digital in a very elastic way, and I'm going to use virtual in an elastic way. How about the quantum turn? If you look at the writing and the work of Black quantum futurism, Rashida Phillips is writing and speaking about. She believes that black people or people of African descent all over the world are like quantum particles, that they interact in ways that are not understood by conventional northern and western history and science. She believes that like quantum particles, there's an instant and unexplainable communication between particles that are separated. She believes that white historical spaces are unsafe for quantum particles because and I'm not explaining this super well, but that spaces like that seek to reduce this energy into instrumental terms that can then be controlled. Check out the BQF stuff. It's like that. It's a real rebuke. And you know, the only thing I would say, I'm really not that smart when it comes to reconciling complex and oppositional and apparently oppositional discourses. But I think we have to get a little bit better about, you know, being productively schizoid and being able to think in mutually exclusive terms and trying to understand what the interaction might be between qualities and ideas that don't seem to agree with one another. I mean, that's why I kind of like the permaculture idea, because it proposes an ecosystem that isn't managed for somebody else's, for a given person or group's power. But even the idea of a commons we have to be suspicious of. So not a great answer, but
Thank you.
yeah. Yeah.
So, and this kind of goes back to the question about community building. So, I love the idea of public assembly, and then where does it go?
So where I think my urban history film should be going, and I haven't done this yet, and it's my fault, is that one needs to think about them as a moment in a process that stretches back in time and forward in time. What's an example? At Santa Cruz, we're interested, and I don't know if we'll ever be able to do this because we're so constrained and sometimes we lack imagination, but we'd love to identify potential film and media students before they come to college, when they're young, and then bring them in, and then take care of them after they graduate, so that we don't think of a 4-year undergraduate system as the center of the engagement, but that it's, you know, cradle to grave is a little pretentious. I think the same thing is true with public assembly. So what the urban history project should be is that I think they should happen on a neighborhood level, where you have maybe elders and emergent media makers working together to collect historical material, to show it locally, to contextualize these sometimes extremely cryptic, you know, home movies and pictures that can be very, very cryptic. And then maybe they get shown locally. And then at a certain time, some of these local efforts coalesce into the kind of big screenings I do. But it's the process. And you're not thinking about it as making movies. You're thinking about it as strengthening and stabilizing communities. I'm trying to give away, so I did 5 of these in Detroit, and I built up a very large collection of historical Detroit footage. And I've been trying to give it away. And it's really hard to give things away well. I made an offer on social media, and a lot of people said, yeah, we want to show the movie. But it's not about showing the movie, right? This is only, you know, it's about the process. And I was interested in trying to find people who, you know, might be able to create a position of somebody who could then become a, you know, a convening effort in the city of Detroit. But then, you know, you've got to pay somebody to do that. You've got to give them benefits. By then you're spending from 0, which is what I spend now, to $100,000. So what I'm going to try to do is get a small grant to live in Detroit for a little while so that I can give it away in a more principled way rather than just parachuting in and saying, here. Or finding an organizational home, which might not be the best. So,
or maybe a blogger who has voluntary contributions.
it could be a blogger. But, you know, I I've been a volunteer, and I think it needs to, history needs to be infrastructure. I'm going to talk about this tomorrow in the workshop. History should be like air. You know, it should permeate the environment as a choice if you want to historicize your environment. And to do that, I think it really needs a high level of support. I agree with you that some of the great things we have to point to right now in terms of uniting past and present and future have been done by people who are devotees, who really want to see it happen, but I want to work harder on that. Well, yeah, go ahead.
I have one more thing that kind of related to the VR, the virtual reality. One thing that kind of came at me was, from your presentation, was that the tactile is devalued in digitizing things. It's almost like Spock's brain, you know, that's all that's important. That touching the items is not.
Yeah. And I'm curious how we're going to come to terms with that, because you know now we're getting a little better at replaying immersive experiences with haptic feedback and so on. And you know the sex industry, as always, is leading, but I don't know if we're going to do a very good job at dealing with that. I mean, for one thing, there's an immense bill to pay when you start dealing with VR and AR and you know much more immersive technology, and most of the money is the entertainment industry, and they're doing safe things. You know, they're building certain kinds of, and the more experimental, the research side is marginalized, as experimental media has been marginalized vis-a-vis. So I hope we come up with a sense about that isn't simply about, you know, you're going to smell the blood as we recreate the battle of this and that, you know, or you feel a spear coming into you. I don't, you know, that's not necessarily the kind of history we need to. So, I mean, I share your concern.
Well, thank you all for coming, and let's give Rick a huge hand.
Thank you for your kindness and patience. I appreciate it.